Hello everyone, this is Sam Biagetti of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. So these lectures are on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link will be in the description. And if you can contribute at any level or with any amount, you'll have access to my patron-only lectures on Myths of the Month and the history of the United States in 100 objects. But now I want to introduce a very special segment about depictions of the 1980s in current television that I recorded a few weeks ago together with my friend, the television critic Sonia Saraiya. And if you listen closely, you may hear contributions from Kali the cat. So to introduce you, I am here once again. The guest has become the host. I am at the home of my good friend, Sonia Saraiya.
Hi.
Who is a television critic, who's written television criticism, commentary, analysis for a whole variety of outlets, including currently as a staff writer for Vanity Fair. Right.
Yeah,
so
accurate.
Welcome, Sonia.
Oh, thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is fun. We've been looking forward to it. Hopefully it'll be fun for our audience.
We always get into our big conversations whether or not there's recording happening. So this feels like a nice opportunity.
Yes, we always have a lot to chew over. We were just having a little royal family discussion, working it out. Oh, yeah. So
when we get into Sam's Meghan Markle thoughts, we'll be ready. We'll get to them later.
Yes.
Yeah.
If anyone wants my expert opinions. But a few weeks ago, we were talking about history depicted on television, which is, an area of intersection of our fields. And I think we both realized that there's definitely a pattern of a lot of shows currently or recently that are grappling in some way with the 1980s. Right? And sort of 80s nostalgia, for one thing, has become almost like a trend, right? People who are coming of age in their 30s and 40s sort of have these, gauzy memories of the 80s.
Like aesthetic touchstones more than any idea of what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And often, very superficial, often, the fashion, the music.
Yeah.
And obviously Stranger Things comes to mind, which is a show I really like. Yeah. Right. And
I didn't know you really liked it. That's funny.
I do. I mean, it's not one of my favorite recent shows, but I definitely enjoyed it. The last season I just watched, it was my only preparation for this conversation, was watching the last Stranger Things. And I didn't like it as much as the earlier ones, but I thought I still enjoyed it. But at the same time, we thought very quickly, you thought of Chernobyl and When They See Us. There's this whole pattern of shows that are often quite gritty and that seem to be somehow trying to make sense of the 80s in a way that maybe a lot of people couldn't when they were little kids. Yeah. And now as adults, we're trying to kind of excavate what happened and in a way like where we came from. And I was born in the 80s myself. I think
Me too.
You were too. Yeah. And I have very faint memories. I vaguely remember being aware, like, George Bush is the president. It's 1989. But that's really it. And in a way, it's like it's the most current era that I wasn't really prepared to be part of, but that is only memory. And it also happens that it's just sort of long enough in the past that academic scholars and historians are trying to say something about it. So I thought maybe we can start. We have sort of a few shows we thought of, and I thought maybe we can start with The Americans. And I really liked The Americans as well. I thought it got a little slow, like in the middle, but it kind of got really interesting at the end.
I really thought the ending was incredible. Just so you know, I was always a little bit on the fence about the show, which actually has something to do with the history element of it, because I felt a little bit just like, so you're gonna put me in the mindset of like communists who are trying to kill Americans, and like I'm supposed to really care about what they're going through, but I'm having a lot of trouble because I keep just wanting them to stop being spies. Like, I think they should just quit. Like, I don't know, this is not a very good opinion, but I just struggled with it a little bit. And then by the final season, I just feel like they really started to bring some stuff to bear in a way that like really worked for me. Like really forcing the parents to look at what they'd done to their kids, for example, which I think is one of the most interesting parts of the whole thing, which is like, so Elizabeth and Philip Jennings, who are played by Kerry Russell and Matthew Rhys, they themselves were born in the Soviet Union, and then they come over when they're like teenagers, and they are assigned to marry each other. They're strangers to each other otherwise, but then they like live a family life in the suburbs of DC, and they have 2 children who have no idea like who they really are. They have American accents, they do American things, they drive American cars, and then like every few weeks they get these like weird messages and they have to do a mission.
Yeah, you have to go kidnap someone, you have to go spy on someone,
like steal some data,
blackmail someone.
Often they don't know what it's being used for. I mean, which is actually one of the most interesting things too, is like they're cogs, but they don't know where it's going, but they care so much. And especially you see both of the characters, both husband and wife, over the course of the show, like struggle a little bit with how loyal they want to be to the Soviet Union versus like this country that they live in. But it is like remarkable that like right through it. I mean, I don't think this is a spoiler. They are like they took an oath. Like that's their lives.
Well, it's also interesting that especially early in the show you see ambivalence and second thoughts on the part of the husband. Yeah. Whereas Elizabeth, the wife, is more of a true believer, and she doesn't waver in the same way.
She's like the ideologue. She's scary.
Yeah, she is sometimes scary. And I think that all of those things you pointed out all kind of relate back to the title and like this intense irony in the title. And, you know, all the posters of the show, you always see the 2 of them. They are the linchpins that everything revolves around. And so you think, okay, so they are the Americans, and is this like a bit of a joke because we know that really they aren't? But then on the other hand, are they? Maybe they are Americans. They're living in a conventional middle-class life. They're successfully passing themselves off as Americans. And then there's the children. And does the title apply to the children too, who are American born and who, at least for most of the show, have no idea that they even have any connection to the Soviet Union? It's like there's this constant question of what does it mean to be an American, and how do you know that you are an American, right? And the American identity, like if you look at it from the point of view of other countries, America is very weird. I mean, in many different ways. But one of the ways that America is weird is that our identity is like very fraught, and it's very ideologically charged. It's like you must believe certain things. There's this kind of philosophy of life and these slogans of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and all this that have kind of been used to demarcate who passes, right? Who counts as American. And we'll use phrases like un-American, like doing that, you know, House Un-American Activities Committee. There's no like House Un-French Activities Committee, right? Like, although there is a lot of anxiety now about the French identity and Britain and things like that, but in America, there's always this sort of political charge to being an American.
Well, you buy in to being American. Like you can come from elsewhere, but you buy in. And they de facto have bought in because they have a very suburban life. It's a very conventional life, their undercover life. Yeah. That's actually one of the tensions I enjoy about the show, is that what they find objectionable to America is like an interesting question, because they're very comfortable. Like they have this nice life.
They're doing fine.
They're doing fine. Like they drink coffee in the morning and they go to, and over the course of the show, they explore a lot of like the types of social things that people would do in the 80s. Like one of them is the Est group, which I think is like one of the most interesting period things, where it's kind of like a sort of like a self-help group seminar series.
Was that real? Do you know if Est was real?
I think it was real. Okay. Or I actually do think it was real, but I can look it up if you would like.
But that's really interesting that you point that out, because if you look at like recent historiography about the 80s, like by historians, that's one of the things that some people point to as like, this is an important trend of like self-fashioning, self-development, self-help that started in the 60s and 70s and really continued strongly through the 80s. So the sort of conventional wisdom might be, well, the 80s was a conservative time and it was like a retrenchment, a return to like the 50s, right? We have 80s nostalgia. The 80s had 50s nostalgia. But it really, at the same time, there was a lot of social shift, a kind of new individualism that came up in the 60s and 70s and then really continued through the 80s. And you can see as one of the defining features of the 80s, and that the 80s, in a lot of ways, were not really a return. And you can look at Reagan and say, well, Reagan was a kind of conservative or even, a nostalgic reaction, return to a kind of idealized older America. And yet at the same time, he was a Hollywood actor, he was an entertainer, and he was kind of drawing on popular culture and American consumerism and individualism, right? Mm. And the Jennings, like, it makes sense in a way to put the Jennings in the 80s, right? They're kind of self-inventing, right? They're kind of self-dramatizing, shaping this image and lifestyle for themselves that works in the context of America. I think it just points to like a lot of paradoxes and tensions, right? About what was America and how much can America change, right? And how much can people change, and how much can it still be a continuity, that this is still the same country, this is still the same society, right?
Well, especially when you like put it ideologically opposite the Soviet Union, which is supposed to, I mean, at least in some theoretical way, like promotes collectivism, promotes working towards a shared goal. The idea of the individual self-determined person, it's like a convenient American myth. And I mean, or like, I think it's a real thing that happened, but I think it's also, it really fed into who America wanted to be at that time, in a way. Like,
yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because Elizabeth in particular questions America more, and she has an old friend who was a Black Panther, and that's one of the few times where the show says, this era of time isn't that great. Like, maybe maybe there are things about America that needed to be fixed about this time. And it's really, I mean, the show, it incorporates all these things because on one hand, like, certainly seems better than Soviet Russia. That's like my casual, like, political opinion.
Yeah, wouldn't really want to live in the Soviet Union, no.
But on the other hand, you can't deny that the 80s are the beginning of like unchecked capitalism on Wall Street, that like these continuing racial divisions like entrenched and soured and worsened after all of the advances of the 60s and 70s, like things started to move back in a different direction in the 80s. What's interesting is that the show forces you to reckon a little bit with like the nostalgia of the period, to be like, well, is it really that great? Aren't there real reasons that someone might not want this to work?
Yeah, it's trying to take, I think a lot of these shows are trying to advance to like a more adult view and like more of a reckoning with the 80s and with the contradictions and the unresolved tensions that then continue. And, the 80s were the last period of the Cold War, right? And so the Cold War gives you this easy kind of binary opposition of us and them. We know who we are, we know what we stand for, we know what an American is because we are the opposite of them. East versus West, communism versus capitalism, right? But then I think The Americans is a show that sort of throws a wrench into it all by saying, well, what about someone who is like doing both? What about someone who is completely immersed on both sides? And like, what kind of confusion and crisis are they maybe going through if they're living both? And like, some people did. I don't think the show is realistic in the sense that nobody could have been doing all of those things, like running all those operations and raising 2 kids and running a business.
They seem to be more effective at being spies than any Russian spies on American soil were. Based on what we know, it sort of seems like I read this New York Times article that was about like remember there was like 8 Russian spies that they found who had like Facebook profiles and had found in America.
Yeah.
And like the things that they would do were like, well, we'll read the headlines and send them back to them because like they're not supposed to know that kind of thing. Like the wildest like infiltration. It's a different
not
world.
Exactly
it's
James
a different
Bond.
society, right?
Yeah,
it's
James
different.
Bond level. Yeah. But what's interesting, I think then, and that might explain part of why there's this fascination with the 80s, is that we know that shortly after the Cold War did end, and there was this American triumphalism in the 90s of like, we've figured it out, right? End of history.
End of history, right.
Francis Fukuyama will never live down that headline. End of history.
Nor should he.
Yeah, right.
You write clickbait, you get dragged for it.
Right. You get dragged. So there's this period then of thinking that the American way of life, American liberal democracy, has basically won the contest of history. Everything is resolved now. And everybody wants to be American, right? The Eastern Bloc, South Africa, right? After apartheid, we'll just privatize everything, make it like America.
India's economy liberalized in 1992. That was like a big thing, I remember. Yeah.
And of course, Britain was already doing this, right? The Thatcher and after Thatcher period. But then it's like, but wait a second, but if everybody is like America, then what's America?
Who's America?
Right? We're right back to this confusion about how do we know what America is about? Where are we going? Are we just kind of like going off into this endless sunset? So I think there's a lot of anxiety now that's come back, right? And if you don't have this clear ideological divide of here's what America is about, here's what Americanism is, then I think, in my opinion, that's part of why some people are turning more towards racial, like a racial definition of like, that's how we demarcate who counts as American and who doesn't, right? So all of these other shows we mentioned all kind of touch on, I think, a lot of these same problems.
Yeah. Stranger Things has the most like nostalgic take on it, but I think that it is nostalgic for the simplicity of the us-them dichotomy. The like, well, we're these guys and
they're the Red Army.
In the third season of Stranger Things, the bad guys are Russians, like literally, which is like very funny.
And they wear like the red caps, like we're Russian army.
Yeah, right. It's like, it's a really wild, and they have like an underground bunker. It's like very, it's a very, it's like hacky a little, like, but I think on purpose, sort of like, these are the touchstones of identity, American identity at this time. And then the other thing about Stranger Things is it's like, it's pre-globalization, it's pre-internet. So it's this hermetically sealed kind of American childhood, perhaps, that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and well, in the fictitious Hawkins, Indiana is like this, very cleaned up, simple little American microcosm, right?
Oh no, I'm worried that she's sleeping on the connections, but I'm just gonna
move
this
as long as she's not chewing them, that's fine.
No, she's not gonna. She just wants to sit with us.
We have a cat commentator too.
We have a cat. Hi, Callie. You want to make a noise for us? No noise. She's sniffing the microphone.
She's sniffing. She's curious.
I don't know if we got any content from her, but anyway,
we may later. We'll get a comment. But yeah, Stranger Things, I feel like the third season was not the greatest TV I've seen, right? Although I enjoyed it. But it does, I think, consciously pack in so much of these themes.
And that season in particular, the third season, is like this testament to the mall. It's like a monument to the mall.
And as they say, the mall is supplanting Main Street, right? So it's like, if you were to think, okay, what is like a microcosm embodiment of America circa 1910 or 1920? You'd picture a Main Street with the shops and the diner, right? In the 80s, it's now a mall, right? And so there's no post office, there's no church, there's no library.
Right.
It's just stores.
Right.
And you hear music and you buy clothes. Like, this is now kind of like America being enacted, is the mall, right? And it's so evocative, I think, now, because now the malls are closing. Now it's like, okay, so what even fills that role now?
They filmed that in an abandoned mall in Georgia. I believe it's in rural Georgia, where they were like, if it wasn't abandoned, it was just like very like low use, because all of the storefronts were like old. Like they were able to use,
it was like hermetically sealed. It
basically
was like a leftover mall.
Yeah.
And I have seen some malls. I was not even prepared. Like, a few times I've gone to a couple of malls in New England, and I was like, all those storefronts are empty. There are 5 people here.
They're like weird time capsules. Yeah.
They're weird time capsules.
Because the stuff that's left is weird. Like the stuff that still works. But then also sometimes you'll just have like the old signs or like the old buildings.
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there.
There's one that I saw where clearly the rent was so low, there was so little demand that some people were just renting stores for their own storage and were just putting like their clothes and furniture in there, and they weren't even stores. It's just like, here's somebody's junk, and then like, you know, a department store.
A lot of times it's clearly a import-export shop front that's like, you know, a bunch of stuff, like a container ship from overseas somewhere where they make these things cheaply.
Yeah.
And then it's like one guy's got this one pack, like container of stuff where they're just going to sell it out of the storefront. And it's always like not super great quality, but nothing at the mall was ever super great quality.
Yeah.
It's sort of like everyone's figured out globalization now. Like it's not just the Gap and Express. It's like, you know, now everyone's making things overseas, and we can do that on the internet now. Like, I don't know. It's like the capitalism full circle is what it feels like. It's just like first we outsourced, like first we got rid of Main Street, and then you have this mall thing, and you thought that was going to be the end stage, but actually it's just going to be even smaller until it's just, you know, someone has a storefront on their computer and someone buys it on their other computer, and that's all capitalism really needs.
It's arbitrage. We can do arbitrage. Yeah. And some people, you know, there's like a notion that, well, the malls and retail are being undercut because of Amazon and internet. And that's true to some degree, but really it's more just the middle class is now poor. Like middle class people just don't shop for extra stuff anymore. Or when they rarely do, they might do it online.
Right.
It's really like the whole shift. It's the concentration of wealth. So that kind of like Hawkins, Indiana, you know, again, Hawkins, Indiana is a simulacrum of something that doesn't really exist. But now even that doesn't exist as a simulacrum, right? Like this is not what towns look like anymore, and it's not what malls look like. But when I think of Stranger Things, you know, there are these moments where they capture in this funny, you know, in this weird, distorted way, they capture like Cold War paranoia. Like, we're going to get our own binoculars and look for Russians. And there's a point where they're like looking and they see a guy dressed in dark clothes carrying a package, and they think he must be a Russian. It turns out he's an aerobics instructor. And it's kind of like it captures this feeling of somehow it's almost integral to America to be afraid of foreign infiltration, to be afraid of Russian infiltration. It's like part of what Americans do is like watch out for Russians who are our opposite, but are also similar enough to us that they could pass, that they could trick us, right? And so I think like it's the same situation in the Americans, just like seen from the other viewpoint of like, where are the Russians coming and hiding? And also, I liked the earlier seasons more. I thought they were more intriguing. And there are all these great people. I mean, Winona Ryder is so great and like always, I think, fascinating to watch.
And herself an 80s touchstone.
Yeah, right. Well, she's like an 80s reference acting in the show. And I thought what was really interesting about Stranger Things was the same thing that really got me initially interested in Game of Thrones, was seeing this distorted other parallel world, which is in Stranger Things, it's the upside down, right? And so it's like in this whole kind of tradition of fantasy and science fiction of creating like a weird, like misshapen mimicry of our world, right? Like Alice in Wonderland. Like Will is a lot like Alice in Wonderland. It's like a darker even Alice in Wonderland. And Alice in Wonderland originally is Alice through the looking glass, right? It's you but flipped. It's the scary inverted version of you. And so I was so fascinated with like, what is the upside down and how does it work and what is it? How does it reflect us? What is the relationship?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't really go anywhere. And it crossed my mind. I was like, well, maybe this is part of why it's in this 80s show, is that like it has this Cold War background of like there's this other country out there that's like us, but it's like the opposite. It's like our evil mirror image. Right. And then in the third season, they just make it explicit. They don't really do anything more, but they do have the lifeguard character, right? Billy. I was a bit confused. I wasn't sure I understood. Does he go to the upside down and come back and he's changed, or does he switch with his mirror image?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because I thought initially that was what was happening, was that it's like his doppelganger
I think it is his doppelganger, because doesn't everyone come back like zombified, like from the mind flayer?
Yeah, the mind flayer somehow like gets into their bodies and they change. And so I thought initially it was like, okay, he meets his evil doppelganger in like the parallel world, who then comes and takes his place in the real world, which is like something that happens in folklore all the time, like old European folklore of like your evil doppelganger replaces you. And you have to think about, like, would my family know that it wasn't me?
And they explicitly have a scene with his family, right? Like, or with his
and his family are loving it.
Yeah.
They're like, this is great. He's great. Yeah. And that also resonates with the Americans, right? Where the Americans, they took the identities of two people who had died,
they
right?
They are the mirror images. Yeah.
And that's something I think spies really do.
Yeah.
I'm in my understanding.
Take like a real.
They'll find someone who died very early in life and is obscure and take their names and have a fake birth certificate and so on. So I think it almost touches on this like deep kind of existential anxiety, right? Again, about identity of like, who am I? And like, could someone who looked and sounded like me just take my place? Or like, what would happen in the world, you know?
That's really interesting, because I think that one of the things that I have noted about the 80s stories, and there's a little bit of like 90s nostalgia too, that's like sort of on the edge of returning. Like, you know, there's the Monica Lewinsky series coming up, and there's the what was the other one? The O.J. Simpson series. So those are both like, you know, early 90s, mid 90s. But I think that they kind of point to the same thing, which is this sort of feeling that like the official story wasn't the real story, or like what was visible, there was something visible and something hidden in the narrative. And so I know that you're talking about something more explicit with the flipping, but that's the upside down actually immediately made me think about that, because, and I'm just going to go into the other shows, but like with When They See Us, you see this intense conflict between how people see the kids and who the kids really are, and you are forced to see the kids. And I do think that the title is very explicit on that front. Like, when they see us, will they ever see us as who we really are? But in the meantime, the whole construction of that time, at that time, the Central Park Five, turns them into horrible doppelgangers. You know, they're not really who they are.
Monstrous versions of themselves. Yeah. And I think Ava DuVernay is very conscious about insisting that you see the events unfold from their point of view. Yeah. You know, and that because a certain number of people already are aware of the story, and they might think, oh, well, it's bad, they got falsely accused, and then later they got exonerated. And some people, of course, still don't even accept that. Still don't accept that, yeah. which is a whole other incredible thing unto itself. Yeah. But that she insists that you are in their shoes for a moment in this mediated way, seeing the way they're being questioned, the way they're being trapped, right? The way they're being deceived, and how that pulls them in to this situation beyond their control.
And they're not being seen. I mean, I think that's like another interesting, like, to go to your sort of mirror thing, like, They remade a video with Corey, who's like has the most tragic story of the five, I would say, because he was put in solitary. He was an adult, so he was put in solitary confinement for many years. So when they get him to say something on tape, you know, and they recreate this video, and it's actually very like nostalgic the way that they recreate it, because like there's a Pepsi can and they made sure they got like the right label Pepsi can to put on like this little desk, and he's wearing this graphic sweatshirt. And when you watch the real video, it looks less period than the remake, because it's like it seems like they really go for it.
Way, yeah.
But it's like not like I don't know what to say. It's not convincing. He says, the way he talks about rape, he's like, yeah, I did it. Like, I did it to her. He doesn't know what he's saying. Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It feels like the difficulty of seeing what it really is, seeing this situation for what it really is, that it takes so long to do for so many people, or that at the time, for whatever reason, no one could see it the way it was, or only a few people could see it the way it was, and it takes so, like, it's really striking.
Well, you see how law enforcement have this control over what the public sees and hears and when, and there can be so much production and so much coercion that goes on for so long before anyone even gets any information. Like, they are the curators, and they kind of control the story, and they control the image that people see.
It's a very pre-social media thing too. I mean, there has been stuff written about how like the way that the narrative around police brutality, police misconduct has changed now that we have smartphones and we can catch them in the act. I mean, it doesn't actually change the outcomes necessarily, but it's amazing how much more control we have over the narrative than we did in this time.
It's a tremendous change factor, you know, and it's not like these incidents just started 10 years ago. They've been going on for centuries. Right. But like now there's this whole other channel where people can become aware of these things in a different way. And obviously Donald Trump is kind of looming and is hinted at repeatedly all through the show.
All of these 80s things, actually. I feel like he's a little bit just, you know, he's a gag at this time. Like he's a joke, but he's a symbol of Wall Street, whatever, or, you know, Manhattan greed, whatever.
Yeah, Manhattan real estate. Yeah. But clearly, I think with When They See Us, it's like the attack happened in 1989. Most of the events in the show happened in 1989. It's like in fact, I think it was November 1989, like just as the Cold War was about to end.
It's the summer. But maybe the trial happened because it's like the heat. It was like a heat wave and stuff.
That's right. That's right. The attack was in the summer of 1989. Yeah.
But that's when the Cold War is ending.
Yes. Yeah. And it's extraordinary to me that in the autumn, I think the trials began in the autumn 1989. And there's paranoia, there's, you know, classic racist assumptions that black men are dangerous, they're animalistic, right? Wilding, wolf packs.
Traveling in packs, right? Traveling in packs.
Yeah, talking about them as these animal creatures, predators, even when you're talking about young boys, right? Because another racist assumption is that there are no black children. They're like immediately adults, right? And they all have to be treated like adults.
And the youngest was 14. I mean,
yeah. They're like barely high school age, and they're treated as both as adults and as like dangerous animals that have to be controlled both at once. And so there's clearly this carryover from the Jim Crow era, right? And even before the Jim Crow era, even though the Jim Crow era, first of all, the Jim Crow era is supposed to be over, right? Formalistically, it's supposed to be over after the Civil Rights Act, right? Yeah. And it's the North, right? We're not talking about the Deep South here. We're talking about New York City.
Right.
So it's so striking. And then to think that people who were somehow involved in this are still important and still have power now. Like there's no rupture point.
Right.
I think in a way this show is doing a lot of the same sort of work that some scholars are doing, of saying, no, there are these trends and patterns that continued right through the 1980s, right? And that we're still kind of playing out now.
So it's not the inflection point that it might seem to be in certain significant ways.
In some ways, and some not. It's more like there's more like endless cycles. Yeah. And so something else I thought of was, wait a second, 1989, isn't that when David Dinkins came in? Oh. Right? So the first black mayor of New York was actually elected that November 1989, within days.
Wow.
Well, I won't give it away. I have another little personal end of Cold War story.
Oh, really?
That I want to tell that's really great. My mother's birthday's in November, November 9th, and she was working for the Canadian Broadcasting Company at that time with she was like an editor working with journalists, and one of them was a very accomplished, very hardworking journalist, and she said, "Brian, it's my birthday. We're all going out to have a nice long lunch and have drinks for my birthday." And he said, "But I can't stay out for long. What if something happens?" My mother said, "Nothing's gonna happen. Nothing's gonna happen. Don't worry, Brian. You know, it's just a little while." They get back to the office. The Berlin Wall has fallen. So yeah, everything's happening around them. Wow. And then that was within a few days, I believe, of when Dinkins was elected mayor. Wow. So you have the first black mayor coming into office at the same time that you have this law enforcement system, like
Right.
we've been talking about,
Right.
using all of this racist rhetoric.
Miscarriage of justice, like
Total
massive
miscarriage of justice that isn't resolved for years,
Yeah.
or really is never resolved.
It ends
right.
up costing the city a ton of money, by the way.
Right. As police misconduct and prosecution misconduct often does. It costs taxpayers millions. And then you think, okay, there's this echo here where we're also thinking about Donald Trump in the background.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, 20 years later, you get Barack Obama, first black president, followed by Trump. And in New York, you have Dinkins, first black mayor, is immediately followed by Giuliani.
Right.
Who some people see as like a reaction
conservative,
to.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly
yeah.
a law and order candidate, right?
Absolutely.
Very public safety guy.
Prosecutor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting because I think that, so one of the things we were talking about earlier was like like, how do you know if you're really American? Like, what's the actual test? What really makes us all American for being here? And I think that when they see us really illustrates is that there were all kinds of Americans who weren't passing the test. Like that there is real doubt as to who the Americans are, like throughout this period of time. Yeah. Or if not, maybe doubt's not the right word, but certainly confusion. Because when you talk about what being American is, I mean, if we want to go down to like ideologically, especially in contrast to the Soviet Union, what we would say is things like, we have due process. You have a right to be heard. You are innocent until proven guilty. There aren't going to be any secret trials. You're not going to get shot in the street, whatever it is. And you see all these things happen in the Americans, like they're not subtle about Soviet justice or anything like that. But then it's like, that's just not the case. Like we have defined ourselves as being these different people, but we are not. Like that seems to be sort of I'm taking from it.
There's this like ideological structure to things. But I also thought when they see us sort of illustrated this dilemma where we have all of these processes and procedures where people have to judge and weigh, do we have evidence to suspect this person? Do we have evidence to charge this person? Do we have evidence to convict them? And you're supposed to have a jury. And yet the assumption running through it all is that the people making those judgments are going to judge based on evidence, right? That they're actually going to weigh evidence rather than just pick the conclusion they want and run with it, right? And there's this feeling of inexorability, which I think Ava DuVernay also really wants to capture, that like once the gears were in motion, there was sort of no stopping it.
Right.
And it didn't matter what the arguments or counter arguments were.
Right.
Someone had come to the conclusion. I thought, to me, the most amazing scene that stuck with me actually was when the police investigator speaks with the prosecutor, and the prosecutor is extremely skeptical of the case and is saying, this doesn't look strong to me. Yeah. And yet she never contemplates, well, then maybe they didn't do it.
She doesn't drop the charges.
No, right. we're still prosecuting them as if they did it.
Right.
I just want it to be stronger so I can get a win. But there's no moment of reflection of like, maybe our conclusion is wrong here and we should go back to the drawing board.
Right. So I'm going to derail us for 1 second because I think that what's interesting about that is like the Central Park Five were targeted and fixated on the way they were because of it was this high profile rape case in Central Park. Yeah. The first episode of The Americans has a rape too. It's a flashback. It's when Elizabeth is recalling that her trainer, her Soviet trainer, assaulted her terribly, like right before she came to America. And I think that like the way that other people react to assault is like an interesting like seed here. Like I think that and you see this come up later because then O.J. Simpson is just a few years later, where it doesn't really become about what happened anymore. It's just that people need some sort of closure to the narrative, like some sort of like, we did something about this, like we didn't feel safe, so now we have to feel safe in some way.
Yeah. And did you see the whole incident where Liam Neeson was speaking about his past recently?
And he said that he'd used the N-word at some point, right?
Well, that may have been part of it. But basically he said, I had a very good friend who was raped. I think this was in the 1960s maybe. And it was very upsetting to him. And she said that the attacker was black. And they didn't really have a lot of other information. So Liam Neeson said, I had a very strong impulse to go attack a black person, like as retribution. And he said he like trolled around African American neighborhoods, basically looking for a fight as like a tit for tat. And you know, obviously that's extremely upsetting and like frightening.
Now, by the way, I remember it wasn't him. It was Viggo Mortensen with the N-word. Sorry to Liam Neeson. Carry on.
But he didn't use the N-word.
As far as I know, he did say this other insane thing. But yeah.
And you know, people questioned him about this and said, how could you think such a thing? How could you react that way? And for one thing, he related it to his upbringing in Ireland and said, well, there would be an attack, there would be a bombing in a Catholic bar. Roman Catholics would go and retaliate against Protestants, and it was like this endless tit for tat. And it's like, I thought, well, that's very interesting that he relates it to that, but also that it translates so easily into like the American mindset of like a white woman is attacked, you take out retribution on black people,
right?
Like regardless of whether it's the person or not,
any black person,
because they're interchangeable.
Yeah,
you treat them as interchangeable. It was like, it's amazing how it's really thought-provoking and kind of disturbing how easily it translated into that. Yeah. But also as for like the miscarriage of justice, it's like it depends on what exactly you mean and what you're thinking of as justice, right? Like how does it matter to you, like who specifically individually is guilty and in what way? There are still some people who are like, I don't care, who don't accept the exoneration, including the prosecutor. Yeah. I don't remember her name.
Linda Fairchild?
That sounds right. Fairstein. Yeah. And that she still thinks she did everything right.
She wrote an op-ed to the effect. It was really upsetting. Yeah.
Amazing.
The city of New York has exonerated them and paid them like reparations. Like, just to be clear, like there's no one has any doubt about this, but
there's no reasonable doubt. And and it shouldn't, from the very beginning, the evidence pointed to one attacker, not a group of 5 kids. So it clearly, like, this doesn't seem to matter. It's just get a conviction, blame someone, get a conviction. And it made me think, when I was thinking about this, I remembered a very, very thought-provoking academic article that I read from like the 1970s that someone pointed back to when talking about different cases, that our system of punishment and justice, in quotation marks, has been so taken over by plea bargaining, right? And the sort of philosophy of plea bargaining is you bring pressure to bear and get a confession. And then you don't need to do a trial. You don't need to weigh the evidence. You don't need to have a jury.
Right.
You just do what you need to do to get them to confess to something. And then you can say, we caught them. This person is guilty. And there's a line in When They See Us where one of them says, well, there's sort of no way to get past the confession. Once people see you confessed, it's like all thought shuts down. It's just like, that's it. And this article said, look, this plea bargaining very closely mimics late medieval and early modern torture. Like, you have a crime, the burden of proof is very high, right? It's hard to prove a case. So what you do is you pick someone you suspect, and if you don't have good enough evidence, you torture them or threaten them with torture, right? You get a confession.
You bully them and isolate them, and
until you get and then the confession solves everything.
And outright lie to them. I mean, which is it's very interesting. I mean, that actually, like, I hadn't really thought about this before, but so I'm jumping again, but let's jump to Chernobyl for a second, which takes place set in 1986, which is when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor blew, because I think that series is really. It's fully in the Soviet Union, and it's really like, how is the Soviet Union different from America? And it's really interesting that they don't say that the difference is the criminal justice system, or like what they say is that Americans are, that at least the Soviets are just so afraid of the truth that they cannot face the truth of what was happening, that the failures of the Chernobyl reactor fire is that on every single level, pretty much on every single level, people could not wrap their heads around what was really happening because it was so bad, and they were so afraid of being the person to say, we did this, we were the ones that fucked this up, that like all the way up the chain, everyone's letting these horrible statistics like fly by. These numbers are way too high.
And they're so locked into an ideology and their own propaganda that they don't really face up to it. Yeah.
Right. But are we really so are we really invulnerable to our own propaganda? I mean, I think this is like the thing. Like, I think that there's like, it's very easy for us right now to be like, oh, like the Soviet Union in 1986, like we would never do this. But I think we have proven that we can lie to ourselves really extensively. And so I find myself like, it's really interesting to me that when they see us in Chernobyl, like existed in the same year, because it's both like, it's like, here's where the Soviets could have went really wrong. Here's where the Americans went really wrong too. Like,
massive denial. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I thought Chernobyl was very powerful. I think you did too. And I thought it was very complicated, like exactly what to make of it. And there were many points where I was kind of trying to make sense of what I was seeing, on top of just like the overwhelming tension of the massive, even greater disaster that almost happened. Right. Which I did not know.
Which I guess if all of the reactors had blown.
Yeah. If it had sort of melted down unlimited, out of control, it would have, they all would have blown, right? And they would have burned down into the earth till they hit the water table and created a massive thermal explosion. And isn't there's one scene, I think, where he's explaining to Gorbachev in the Politburo, he says, well, if they burn down and reach the water table, it'll create a thermonuclear explosion and Europe will be uninhabitable. Like, it will destroy Europe.
Wow.
And to me, the number one thing I thought was, why on earth would anyone create such a huge concentration of destructive power in one place in the first place? Like, why did you even create this situation to start? Now you're cleaning up the mess, right? But why did you set this up in the first place? And the Soviets are not the only people who did that. I know that there's like many different opinions about nuclear power, but my opinion is like, don't be so naive to think this is all going to work perfectly. What could possibly go wrong? Like, you could destroy a continent if you don't perfectly control this huge destructive reactor you created.
And that is a backdrop to this whole thing. I mean, the atomic age is like, really, I guess, refers to the 60s, but we knew to some degree that we were living in the shadow of this threat. Like, I don't think everyone knew the complete details of exactly what nuclear radiation would do to you, but like, it was still the height of the Cold War. That was still the closest apocalypse that people thought of, I think, was like nuclear apocalypse. Like, oh, that's how the world's going to end. And it is interesting that this was an era where the most powerful people in the world were playing with atoms in a way that was incredibly destructive. I mean, I was reading about missile tests. I was reading about the Soviet missile tests. They did one that was like, no, it's really crazy. The biggest bomb that they ever tested is called the Tsar Bomba. It was half the size of the one that they designed, the biggest nuclear bomb ever designed. So they tested one that was half the size. Okay, the blast radius of Hiroshima was a mile. When they dropped the Tsar Bomba, and it was like the super Arctic peninsula, 34 miles away, buildings were flattened. Wow. 62 miles away, you could have gotten a third-degree burn. A third-degree burn.
Whoa.
It's insanity
God.
Anyone was fooling around with this stuff. Like, it's not like, you know what I mean? Like, it's...
And I think that's part of what, like, Dr. Strangelove was trying to capture, was like, all of these things are ridiculous, they're outrageous, and yet in the logic of the Cold War, it's always just like, well, we're just taking the next step. Every step just seems like the logical next step, until you are in total astronomical madness. Right. So clearly there's like a double Cold War resonance, that on the one hand we're looking at the last years of the Soviet Union, and Chernobyl was one of the factors that helped weaken the final years of the Soviet Union,
which I did not know before the series, and then the series at the end suggested, and I was like, oh, it makes sense.
It was part of it. It's like, okay, people really had to come face to face with, like, we can't just take what the government tells us seriously. Like, we just don't.
Well, and they're serious, because we can't. They have massive failures in their
everyone knows that was things are blowing up. But I thought with Chernobyl there was definitely a pattern in the show of showcasing like the heroic individual standing up to the dysfunctional system, which
it's very anti-Russian. I mean, very anti-Soviet in a way.
Very anti-Soviet, yeah.
But then is very pro the average Russian person. Like,
right.
yeah.
There was both.
Yeah.
There was both. And I thought it was interesting how they make a point of showing you all the people who were critical in getting a handle on this disaster and making sure it wasn't 1,000 times worse.
They don't even show you all of them because Emily Watson's character is like a composite. And I thought it was like a couple of people. She's like a composite of like 50 scientists that apparently Jared Harris's character took the lead. But in the photos of him at Chernobyl, he's like surrounded by like 20, 30 scientists who were all over the place. And again, this is heroism. They're all over the place in Russia, and they're seeing these readings that are like crisis, 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 and they go towards it. They all go towards it. They're like, we have to prevent this from getting worse. It's amazing.
Yeah. And so there's a fine line, right, where the show shows you one individual who figures out the radiation is coming from outside, and she acts, and she's critical. And yet, really, it was dozens of people who took action like that. And so you have to ask, well, at what point do you have to say, well, in some ways the system worked. In some ways there were people in place who knew what their job was. They faced up to how bad the crisis was. They acted and they got the job done. So it's like, don't you kind of also have to give some credit to the ways in which the system also worked? And the way the show presents it, it's like they don't exactly say you shouldn't see it that way, but they do emphasize the individuals, right? And how you're making this individual sacrifice that the country much of the time isn't going to appreciate, right? Like the main engineer, the Jared Harris central character, is told like your legacy is going to be erased. Right. Like we do not appreciate what you did at all. And I don't know how accurate that particular detail is, but clearly that's sort of how the show wraps up the story.
Oh yes, that part is accurate. He killed himself in part to get his story out there.
To get his story
further.
out. Okay.
Like, well, I think he knew that it would get some attention to the tapes he was recording, and then those tapes became like underground circulated throughout the scientists.
Like many things did in the Soviet Union. They sort of, there's almost like this like demi-monde of like circulated writings, music, everything. Yeah. So it kind of, I guess it sort of straddles that line, right? And it is giving you more of an American point of view. It's giving you, and partly it's also just the fact that the Soviet Union was on its last legs. A lot of people knew that or perceived it to some degree. The Soviet Union's now gone. So it's like nobody really has much of an interest now in like defending, like, no, we did okay. Like we did save lives by how we handled that particular disaster. And I thought it was great how they showed the mine workers and the maintenance workers and all these people who put themselves in danger and sometimes did die because they knew, like, we have to face this. But
it's interesting because dramatically they made for great screen moments. But most of the work that like those miners did, or the people who were throwing things off the roof, people who put themselves in the most harm's way, did like minimal actual help. You know what I mean? Like,
well, they could only do, in that case, they could only do a little bit before they got completely irradiated.
But I think that I'm thinking through your notion of the system works, because the system works assuming that you have the ability to waste 2,000 to 5,000 people per thing. I think that like the numbers for Chernobyl all over the place because they don't know how many people like got cancer or something from the radiation afterwards. But like it was a messy trial and error cleanup process.
And there were a lot of expendable people who were thrown into the situation. Yeah. Much as the same as what happened, and they sort of refer back to this a little bit obliquely in the show, much as happened in World War II when Stalin said, all right, we have to throw everything we can against this German invasion to save the Soviet Union. And he was like, well, I guess 25 million people are basically expendable. I mean, so many people were thrown.
Isn't it like 40 million people? 40 million Russians died in World War II? Like, it's like
that might be right. Yeah.
It's a crazy number.
It's like 100 times as many as Americans.
As the next ones, yeah.
And they refer to it, customarily, as the Great Patriotic War. And there are even quotes where people spoke to Stalin and people said, you know, because there were a lot of Western communists who were very supportive and would go and people spoke to Stalin and said, it's so inspiring how all of these people are out there ready to sacrifice themselves for communism and the workers' revolution. And Stalin himself said, oh no, they're not doing it for the workers' revolution. They're sacrificing themselves for Mother Russia. That's what this is. Like, he knew.
And what's the difference?
Well,
no, I genuinely want to know, because it's relevant, right? Because now we have Russia ascendant again, but it's not communist Russia, it's oligarch capitalist Russia.
Yeah, it's this weird hodgepodge plutocracy of Russia. And I mean, at the time, there was this split between Stalinists and Trotskyists, right? And Trotskyists were upset because they believed the Soviet Union and Stalin were not doing enough to spread the workers' revolution, that they saw this as the beginning of a worldwide proletarian revolution.
I feel like they were probably correct on that front, that the Stalinists probably weren't doing a ton to
and Stalin didn't
I don't
care.
think he didn't care. that's what I'm trying to say.
No, Stalin was a power player. Yeah, so Stalin, in his view, he thought, I can somehow retrench. It's like, I can retrench and have it both ways, I think was his thinking, was like, stand for communism and global revolution, but also really consolidate and protect the interests of Russia. And he's the one who made like the pact with the Nazis, right? The Molotov-Ribbentrop pact of like, well, we'll just divide Poland, you know, which was shocking to some people. Like, you can't make deals with fascists. And Stalin was like, yeah, watch me.
Well, and I think the idea of Russia as being communist is, quote unquote communist, is always the bogeyman, but really it's that Russia was an autocracy, I think. And I think the idea of the Cold War is technically capitalism versus communism, but I think arguably it's really just an autocracy and another autocracy, like trying to figure out if they can coexist, because not to be super cynical.
Right. And whether you call one or another country an autocracy, there is this debate, I know, in Cold War scholarship, which is like becoming more of an intense field, I think. There's a debate between people who say this was a matter of ideological contest and the world kind of had to figure out where they fit in this ideological feud, or is it just two great powers figuring out who's going to be top dog?
That's what it, I mean, well, and to go, you know, you were saying the thing with like Dinkins followed by Giuliani and Obama followed by Trump, because I think the other thing that's like interesting about the 80s nostalgia is like the Russians are back. Like the Americans, when it was greenlit, people were like, on one hand, people were like, oh, like, why would we do a Cold War thing right now? And then also, like, that story about these 8 sleeper Russian agents had, like, just emerged. And even though they didn't do anything super effective, it was like, there's Russian spies here.
It's like, that's a thing that happens?
It's 2005. Yeah. Cut to, like, Russia's meddling in our elections. We have, like, serious national security problems. Our president is compromised, blah, blah, blah. It's intriguing. Like, it's just an interesting new... the same foe with a different hat. I feel like a different, like now they're capitalists too.
Yeah, I think this is a big question that people are going to have to grapple with for a long time. Is like, some people say, well, we're sort of in a new Cold War, and other people really reject that. And I think it's very confusing. Like, part of what's happening, I think, is that we're seeing that the Russian government has certain strategies because they don't have anything like the military power they used to. I mean, their GDP is like less than Italy. Like,
really?
Yeah. Wow. It's like they in a lot of ways they've been really diminished, and they're sort of scrambling for like, okay, how do we stop the walls from closing in? And they're doing a lot of this kind of secret statecraft, sowing dissension, right? And these are things that, on the other hand, also like all kinds of states have done in all kinds of ways for decades or even for centuries. But we're kind of becoming aware of it in a new way now. It's almost like now you like can't miss it, where previously it could fly under the radar. Now it's kind of blown out into the open.
And you're forced to deal with it very quickly. Like, you don't get 6 years to find out that, oh, that was caused by that person.
Yeah. It's all in real time. And again, like, the information gets out very quickly.
But they have more, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm back to this, but to me, it's like, I think that America and Russia have the same problems internally and externally too, though, which is like, they have, both countries are like run by an oligarchy of capitalists, of you know, very wealthy, pretty corrupt people. It's sort of how I feel. I mean, I'm taking corrupt really broadly here, but like corruption is the problem. Like, I feel like in both places, like sort of as a result of the way that money and politics have intermingled, there's like real civil rights concerns in both countries. Like Putin, like, I don't know, I guess he banned gay people or something like that.
Oh yeah, well, and also in the Muslim regions and Chechnya and Dagestan, I mean, there's huge issues. But it's interesting when you think about the United States, like, in some ways, we're an exceptionally uncorrupt country in that, like, in everyday interactions of, like, I'm going to the DMV, I'm going to the library, like, you don't have to bribe people. Like, we're very uncorrupt, and I think we have a very low tolerance for corruption in, like, face-to-face everyday dealings. And yet, it's a very different story at the top. It's like the farther up you go in the power pyramid, the more there is
more latitude, I suppose, for corruption. Yeah,
there's so much room for corruption. There's so much money, there's so much power. I mean, we're still the big global economy, and there are so many people who are willing to throw money at influencing what the US government does, you know, and there's so much value on getting into those back rooms. And I think that there's a huge crisis now that and again, it's like maybe Russia is sort of serving as like the funhouse mirror distorted image of ourselves, in that people here increasingly feel that America is corrupt. And there's this bigger and bigger gulf between like what people feel they ought to put up with and what they see going on in like how people actually make decisions and set policy. And people feel more and more powerless, right?
And I think the question of how are we different from them has become highlighted again. I think that's all. And I don't, I'm sort of curious about because there's plenty of Russian immigrants in America too. That's like I mean, I don't know if that's relevant or irrelevant, but I do find it strange sometimes when like you're, you know, the 14th time you watch a Bond movie where like the stock villains all have Russian accents and you're like, people immigrate from there to here. Like there's Western Russians. Like, I don't know what we're...
yeah. Well, there are all kinds of... There are Russian Americans. I mean, you think of, like, the Deer Hunter, and there's, like... It's sort of like, well, we're in a town in Pennsylvania where, like, people are Russian. And, like, what are you supposed to tell people when you, like, join the U.S. Army and you have this Russian name? Yeah, and there are Americans and Britons of Russian descent. You know, Helen Mirren is like descended from like Russian emigres.
Oh, is she really?
Who left from the Russian Revolution.
No wonder she liked
Britain.
the Catherine the Great role so much. She really
she has a serious Russian connection. And it's very awkward. And again, it goes to these paradoxes, right? Like we were talking about in The Americans of like, wait, like what do we expect an American to be, look like, sound like? And I thought in The Americans, the show sort of lagged in the middle, as I mentioned before. But an interesting part that I appreciated was when they start to talk. It's sort of like you see their Russianness more and more, little by little, as the show goes on. And you see them talk a little bit about their lives in Russia, which is forbidden, right? They're not supposed to talk about that. And naturally they mention the war, right? The Great Patriotic War and the incredible suffering and incredible loss. And it sort of gives you some illustration of why there would be almost this personal feeling of responsibility to strike back at the West, right? And
that interests me because I think that Elizabeth really believes in communism. I think Elizabeth really believes in communism, so that's also like part of her mission. But I'm not sure that like the people fighting for Stalin were necessarily like believing in communism so much as they were just like, this is what you do. Like you die for Russia.
And it's interesting you point that out because I remember Philip talking more about, I remember the privation, I remember people in my family who died, and it's for him, I think it's more kind of seared into his identity of like, we went through the Great Patriotic War, and maybe for him it really changes his personality when he tries out being an American and he has American friends and he really wants friends, and he does. It's a big deal for him to have these friends. And maybe for Elizabeth it's more ideological. It's more like, I believe in the mission and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. I feel like a commonality that I've been hearing is just the myth of the 80s, both when it was being lived out and then also in hindsight, and then the way it's complicated by these retellings of the history or these stories that are just picking up on the underlife. Like The Americans is fiction and Stranger Things is fiction, but both point to a secret underground. I know it's actually interesting that it's secretly underground, even in the third season, which doesn't have the upside down. There's still a bunker at the bottom of the mall, and it's to me that's like very on the nose too, because it's like the mall, which is like the seat of American capitalism, and like burrowed underneath it very far down is like this little Soviet base that's like secretly controlling it, and it's like the deepest root.
Demagnetizing the magnets. But yeah, I mean, all of these shows somehow are about like discovering and excavating something, something that you weren't supposed to know, something that you weren't supposed to see. Yeah, I really think that's like it kind of creates a mood really through all of these shows, a mood of secrecy and danger. And yeah, and you mentioned Leaving Neverland.
Leaving Neverland. So, because I think that it's not technically exactly in the 80s. Although it begins
Some
then.
of the events are in the 80s.
Some of them, yes, yeah.
About.
So did you see it as well?
I did.
Okay, yeah. So Leaving Neverland is the 4-part docuseries. I'm sorry, is it 4 parts or 2 parts? 2 parts.
I remember 2 parts.
2-part. Leaving Neverland is a 2-part docuseries about 2 men's sexual abuse allegations against Michael Jackson, if you want to use the most legally correct term. To quote BoJack Horseman, allegedly.
It is technically alleged.
And
alleged.
I think that the complete reign of Michael Jackson as the king of pop is something that I think is going to be difficult to explain to future generations, because I don't think that moment in time, the 80s, where America was, well, the 80s and into the 90s, so American triumphalism as well, where America is the king of the world, and then this homegrown pop star becomes this global superstar of with unbelievable success. And at the same time is someone who was raised by an incredibly abusive father in a situation, like in a highly performance-based situation, started being trained at a very young age, if you look at the details of Michael Jackson's life, you sort of start to be in like, well, no wonder everything went. He never went to school. He never went to college. Yeah. He moved out of his childhood home straight into Neverland. He went from being a child, and I want to say he might have been, oh God, I can't remember his exact age, but he was like maybe in his 20s, and he goes straight from his childhood bedroom and again, allegedly with Joe Jackson, but nothing about Joe Jackson's parenting sounds super soft or great, like not a super nurturing environment there, to go straight from that into a fantasy place called Neverland, whereas these 2 men in the docuseries, Wade Robson and James Safeshook, describe being between the ages of 8 and 13 and being repeatedly victimized, among other people who they think were in the same boat. Their stories are very similar. Their stories match other stories. The most famous is a boy named Jordy, who whenever that trial, the public trial was against Michael Jackson, Jordy Chandler was the name of the kid who at the time was anonymous but put the allegations against him. The stories are so similar. The stories are always are often like the boy had talent like Michael Jackson, idolized Michael Jackson, had parents who encouraged these ambitions and tended to be a little bit more permissive with like what the kids could do. And then something that began as this like idolization relationship would turn into this, what sort of seemed like a hectic friendship, like as if they were both in third grade and sending each other notes all the time.
Our besties, yeah.
Like one of the most astonishing things is Wade Robson, who lives in Australia, received faxes from Michael Jackson, would receive them like overnight or while he was at school. Again, he's 8 and 9 years old. And his mom said they would come home and the house would be covered in faxes from Michael Jackson, all like handwritten, like drawings. Like there was like a truly childlike element to this. And then transitions from hanging out at concerts and after to sleepovers, and then to staying there for long periods of time. And then after both of these men have children, they start to have these intense traumatic flashbacks and realize genuinely, both of them, and this is how they say it, and this is how psychology works, although it's very confusing, that they like realize that they look back and they're like, this was wrong. This is stuff that happened that shouldn't have happened. So I think that like it just fits in well with some of the other things we're talking about, because it's a documentary that is excavating underneath this myth, a myth that even at the time we knew was tarnished. I think that for all of the adulation that Michael Jackson got, there were always red flags, I think, about his behavior. Like just the fact that he would do things with his like the plastic surgery, or like his sort of like secretive lifestyle, like the Neverland. Like there were these questions that people raised, but the excavation couldn't happen until later. And I just think that's like it's like an interesting counterpoint, I think. I mean, maybe this is just the act of history. Like we're just going back and re-looking at what happened and then searching for more information.
Yeah. Well, and they were groomed as kids, right? Yeah. And so it's almost like it takes a certain amount of time for these people to mature to the point where they can reckon with everything that happened. So we're kind of getting the wave of that now. It's almost like a little generation of Michael Jackson proteges who are now reckoning with it. And there's this odd paradox, this odd contradiction when you look at Michael Jackson and his conduct. It's like, on the one hand, here's someone who clearly didn't have normal relationships, didn't have a normal upbringing, did not really like learn how to deal with people as an adult, right? And had this childlike, Peter Pan personality or persona, right? Yeah. But at the same time, he clearly also really knew how to run a business, really knew how to produce a video, and really knew what had to be kept secret. Like really knew, like, I need to have this special double door on my room, and
with like these alarm systems and like trip locks. I mean, nobody installs a door like that unless they have something they really don't want you to see.
Yeah. It's really like Caligula's palace. It's like on the one hand, it's like he's not a functioning person. On the other hand, it's like he really knew how to set these boundaries to protect himself and what he was doing, whatever was going on behind those closed doors. It's very confusing. It's hard to know like what to think of him and how his mind was working.
I mean, it's interesting because you say that about the business, and yet I think he was not a very good manager of his money. Like he overspent constantly, and like he knew he was really talented. Like you cannot deny that, and he clearly knew what people wanted to see from him. I think there's no denying that. Yeah. But
well, I think there's two ways of looking at that, because he did overspend and he was often in debt. But at the same time, he owned the rights to so many of these valuable properties that were bringing him revenue. So it's like he could overspend and be in debt, and 6 months later, he'd be flush with cash again. Mm-hmm. He just had constant income, right? It's not like someone who inherits $100 million and blows it. It's like he had this income coming in, and he apparently, from what I have seen, he knew how to buy the right rights to the right songs and things like this to always have that huge income.
Interesting.
Right. It's very complex, and it was didn't you find it very emotionally draining to watch, to just be like, to have all of that new knowledge come at you so quickly and not knowing how to think about it, like not being able to put yourself in the shoes of these people who were having these experiences when they were 9 years old.
Well, and like listening to their, I mean, it's interesting because you feel anger, like you listen to their mothers explain like what was happening, and the boys themselves both say, they're men now, but they both say that they have had serious conflict with their mothers since coming to these realizations, because they're like, how could you put me in this position? And they interview the moms and they look shell-shocked. The Australian one, Wade's mom, is like, it's like she's awoken from a bad dream, like that she just, and this goes back to the myth making to me. I think it's just that like that was her narrative, like she did not really live in a world where Michael Jackson could not be a safe person.
It's funny, with both of the mothers, I thought the American mother, I kind of believed her more, that like she sort of said, I blew it. Like that was her main explanation, was like, I blew it. I didn't keep my guard up when I should have. I made this huge mistake. To me, the Australian mom was a little more mysterious, of like, what are you thinking? And she seemed to still maybe have a little denial. It seemed like it could have been denial. It could have been shame too. And I'm sure there's shame. Yeah,
it's very interesting. Like, I mean, to me, the family dynamics of something like this is interesting. This touches on something we were talking about before, but I think that like what really interests me about some of these large generational shifts or historical arcs is how the family unit is the one that processes it. Like the family unit is what receives it and transforms it, and then remits it out to the new generation. So with Wade in particular, after his son was born and all this came out and his wife like learned about all of this, his wife would not let Wade's mother into the house anymore. And it was like, this was now it was personal. It was like this had been a personal thing. And this was not the myth of Michael Jackson anymore. This is like, you betrayed me. Like that sense of it. And the Americans is a family drama. It is about, and I think some of its best stuff at the end season is about how Elizabeth and Philip have to come to terms with the fact that these children are no longer going to be their children, because they never really were, like, they weren't in good faith actually their children. Like they were raised on a lie, and they,
I think it illustrates a lot of how the nuclear family is kind of like this little iconic world unto itself, and it's the 50s sitcoms kind of give you this image of the nuclear family. The 80s kind of tried to keep that going, right? Even though that's not how a lot of people have lived. Like there's always been extended families, mixed families. Now there's a lot of mixed families. Now there's unmarried parents. Like all of this is common. And how in a way like the nuclear family is its own little like theatrical production that has to be maintained. Yeah, it's this performance. And I'm sure it's really great and works really well for a lot of people. But nonetheless, it's like there's always multiple layers behind the facade, right? And how it's like almost like, how far are you going to dig into? You can chart, like, I mean, I guess Cheers is a little, when does Cheers start? But if that started early 80s.
Yeah. So if you look at like the 70s, Norman Lear shows, a lot of family sitcoms, like different families, like you have the Jeffersons, you have different strokes, whatever. One Day at a Time, which they did a remake of too, but that's a single mother. And then in the 90s, you get Friends and Seinfeld and Frasier and Cheers is, I think, in that group too, even though it's earlier. And it's like these groups of friends, and it's like not the nuclear family anymore. It's interesting, like the transition. Roseanne is in the 80s, and that is a huge hit at that time. And that is a working class family on TV, but that might be...
Starts like right at the end of the 80s, I think. It goes into 90s. You're right. Roseanne, I watched all the way through. And it was so... It was wonderful, and I loved seeing Roseanne, and it was sort of a revelation having this, people who, like, have money troubles being on TV, like, and who weren't always, like, polite, and the mom who wasn't always smiling and making dinner, but to go back to how Michael Jackson, like, really fits into all of this, that he, in a way, he really masters, right, the mass media. He masters, like, video, television, radio, and he becomes so supreme again, like at this last point where maybe that was possible before like media really fragment and specialize.
Yeah.
And it's just not, it's no longer the case that everyone all throughout the world can turn on the radio or the TV and see the same person, right? So he's kind of maybe irreplaceable in that way. And I thought it was really interesting how you can see allusions maybe to Michael Jackson in the movie Us.
Which I have not seen.
You have not seen? Yeah. Well, I really liked it.
It looked really scary.
It's scary. It's scary.
I was like, no.
And, you know, it's by the same maker who made Get Out. And I think Get Out is wonderful partly because it's so tight and it has this like little clockwork plot line.
Precision.
Everything so precise.
Yeah.
Us is a little more, it's imaginative, it's a little more loose. There are like different strands going in different directions. But the central premise is that there's a nuclear family living their lives, trying to live like a nice American life, go on a little vacation. And it turns out that this entire time they have had an evil doppelganger, a copy of themselves, living in like an underground world.
Right.
That is now emerging to come and get them.
Wow.
And it all kind of explodes from there. So it's like,
is the underground world seen? Is it flipped? Like, what is it?
What it is it's like an underground complex, like beneath Santa Monica, I think. It's somewhere in California. There's like an underground complex with classrooms, living quarters, like some kind of scientific base or something underground. And there's this population, this group of maybe a few hundred or so people who are copies of other people who live in the real world, and they mimic them. They mimic all their actions. They copy them. And at some point, it seems they're preparing to like emerge and take their place. So it's like all the exact same themes we've been talking about. And what we're seeing is ostensibly present day, right? But there are flashbacks and memories of the 80s, right? So the woman played by Lupita Nyong'o, who plays both copies of herself, like totally masterfully. She has these vague memories from her childhood where she thinks she saw her copy. And now in present day, she's afraid that her copy self, her doppelganger, is coming back, like to get her, right? And there are further twists beyond that, which I won't give away. But that's the basic idea. She has this anxiety of like the other me that I saw in the mirror is now coming back to get me. And so it's very scary, and all these actors play themselves and their copies like at once. And I had been thinking about it and like, what does this mean? Like, is this saying something about the 80s? And like, there are these little allusions to like Hands Across America and these weird like PR gimmicks from the 80s. And when the evil doppelganger family shows up, they're wearing like red and black jumpsuits and one glove.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I hadn't really put it together. I was like, what is this about? What does this mean? And I read some review somewhere that was like, notice the one glove. Yeah, reminiscent of Michael Jackson in concert.
Yeah.
And Michael Jackson also took part in Hands Across America.
Right, of course.
And it's like, oh, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And I think the movie came out before Leaving Neverland, right?
But the stories about Michael Jackson predate Leaving Neverland, just to be clear. Yeah.
So it seems like, and you know, it's an African-American family. Yeah. And it's like, it seems like there's maybe a little reference to the sort of anxiety people felt at grappling with Michael Jackson and his possible guilt, you know, and his possible crimes.
And to me, because I think, especially when you're talking like black filmmaker depicting black family, at least one black family, that Michael Jackson being like a black American pop star was this like thing that was championed, even as I think the unfair burden of trauma that is carried by black people in America just because of systemic inequality. I think it was like a blindness to that, like a blindness to the pain or to the suffering or to the deprivations that must have existed in order for these people to be so smiling and so sunny and to be America's family, if that makes sense. Like, I think that it's like this interesting myopia. I mean, I'm just like going through the annals, but I'm also thinking about Bill Cosby right now, which sort of has like this other like America's Dad like kind of thing.
He really created the ideal nuclear family.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, right.
And it's very hard. It's a very hard, very thorny situation because there is a really long history of false accusations of black men being sexual predators.
Especially against white women, right?
Especially against white women, right? And with Bill Cosby, many of his victims were white women, right? Yes. Not all. And in Michael Jackson's case, the alleged victims are children, are, as far as we know, are boys.
And boys, yeah.
Yeah. But still, it's like it's so hard, again, to weigh evidence impartially. It's like, what does that mean? Like, what is an impartial standpoint for judging the evidence against someone, and who gets that role, right, of being the impartial judge? And maybe we should leave it off soon, because I feel like that is what I was thinking about with O.J. Simpson and like the People versus O.J. Simpson is like, that was revealing to me, because I remember a certain amount of the O.J. Simpson trial. I remember that being constantly in the news in 1995, right? And then it did give me a new, different perspective, seeing it dramatized and just seeing it as an adult and thinking, oh yeah, like that Mark Furman, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Which I just didn't know when I was a little kid.
Well, and I didn't know what the LA riots were when I was that age. Like I was too young for them, and we didn't live near there. So I didn't have any conception of that trial in LA being in a historical context. Like I didn't know who Rodney King was. Like I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most exciting things about these stories, is that they're helping us create connections that I don't think it was quite as easy to do before. Like, because for example, like at the 25th anniversary of the LA riots, which they made a bunch of movies, documentaries about it, and I like watched them all for a piece I wrote, and I didn't know that the LA riots were intimately connected to the Watts riots from the 60s that were like in a similar geographic area, and just like how this is like lived history. It's not, wasn't a random thing that happened. And like how we now in 2020 are looking back at something 30 to 40 years ago and going, how does this connect to us? Like, how can we draw the lines? And I think these filmmakers, these television makers are looking for them too. I do feel like it comes a little bit from a sense of like, the pot is sour. Like, I don't know if that is like an actual thing, but
the
like,
well is poisoned.
The well is poisoned. Thank you. That's what.
Yeah.
It does come a little bit from like the well is poisoned. Why? Like, how did it get here?
Yeah. And there's this horizon effect, which is partly why, like we were saying, like this grappling with the 80s, there might be nostalgia, might be an element of it, but that's not all. It's the fact that we're looking back at things we can remember, but they're the farthest back we can remember, so we don't know what set the scene. Like our memory drops off just before this. Right. So we can't see those connections unless we go revisit it and excavate, right?
What do you think? I know that we won't talk about actual history anymore, but I am curious what you think about television as a tool of history, because I think that for me, it's really exciting to explore history purely, mostly as an amateur, to just be like, take me into this era, take me into this decade, take me into this thing. I didn't really know very much about it, and now I know more, even if it's like the dramatic, like made for TV version.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and it's kind of a sensitive question, because I know a lot of scholars just say TV is distortion. TV is it's fake reality. But I think it depends a lot on how you use it, and I think that it's part of like an ongoing process of interpreting and reinterpreting history. And I think it's very interesting that when history is dramatized, very often the first thing a lot of people ask is that accurate? Did that really happen?
And then they Google it.
Then they start looking it up, or they ask someone, is that accurate? And I think like that is both a good question, and it's good that people are thinking that. It's also at the same time not adequate, because the other side of the coin, I guess, that I try to get across is like all history is myth making in some way. So you can't just ask, is that accurate? Did they do that right or wrong? It's like you have to ask, what is the version of the story they're trying to present? What is the myth they're trying to weave for you? And what agenda does that serve, maybe? And what other ways are there of looking at it too, right? So on the one hand, you can just sort of fact check and say, like, was the Emily Watson character a real person or no? On the other hand, you have to say, okay, what is the overarching story they're trying to present to you? And how else could we look at it? And how else could we tell that story, right? So I'm not against it. I think that people have to go into it with skepticism, knowing this may be inaccurate. And also, even if it is technically factually accurate, it's still trying to tell a certain kind of story.
Right. It still hasn't, it can't avoid having some angle or some myth making or some imposition.
Someone had to, I mean, it's an extremely complicated process figuring out what are the scenes going to be, who are we going to see, and how is it going to unfold for the audience? And that has to be ideologically driven to some degree. You have to have some vision, right? You're trying to get across. So I guess the next step I try to push people to is say, like, let's not just think there's like the correct, accurate history. Let's think of like what we're doing when we make historical stories and myths. That's how I would think
it's
of it.
It's a great answer. Of course it's a great answer.
Thank you.
Well, I think it was just going to keep happening, if you want my TV perspective, because I think that, like, existing IP, as we like to call it, history is just existing IP. Do you know what IP is?
Like Internet Protocol?
Intellectual property. So intellectual property, no, it's fine. So I'm trying to think of a good example here. So, like, you know, the entire Marvel universe is based on existing IP, basically, like existing comic narratives. But then if you are pitching your new TV show, it might be more convenient if you have a book that you can point to, or that was already popular that it is based on. Or a lot of studios that already own the rights to things will just use those rights to create new things rather than try to, like, dig around for a new original story, just because getting the rights to things can be so complicated, and owning the rights to something is so much of the battle for these big studio things. So anyway,
there is an incredible, I think you're right, there's an incredible fund of material in history. Well, I mean, truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah. And people love it. I don't know, just anecdotally, but Chernobyl was a sensation. Like, Chernobyl was not supposed to be as successful as it was. I say this very brazenly, but I feel that I know this to some degree. You know, it's a co-production with HBO and Sky, which is like a British company. And a lot of the ones that are co-productions, especially right now, HBO has been, like, ramping up its output. So a lot of the things that are a co-production with England are sort of like, we just need a little bit more content right now. Like, can we get this over here? Like, it's not going to be one of our flagships. Like Watchmen, for example, that was like their big flagship, HBO's big flagship this spring. Or sorry, this past fall. I know what day it is. But something like Chernobyl is kind of like they did this Catherine the Great miniseries too. They're like, we know our core subscribers are going to love this historical shit, but, like,
it had the formula. Yeah.
It's not that it's formulaic. It's more that it's just like, I can see how it got greenlit so easily, especially because it's like Russia, like, very interesting topic. Like,
we love Helen Mirren.
We love English accents. Like, this is it like checks a lot of boxes. Jared Harris, the king of prestige TV. You know, there's so many easy ways, and I think it went beyond that too, because, like, look, I saw Catherine the Great, and it's fine, but it didn't feel like it had that extra kick that Chernobyl has, where it pushes it all back on you and says, well, what do you think about this? Or, like, does this feel like your memory of who these people are versus who, and, like, how can we use that information now? Yeah. Catherine the Great is just, you know, it's just like, look at the dresses she wore. And that's fine too. I'm just saying, like, I think it's really interesting that those questions work for people. Like, when They See Us debuted, it was briefly like the most watched thing in Black households according to Netflix. Like, just everyone turned it on, and it's really hard to watch, so maybe they turned it off like immediately, who knows. But but, like, it intrigues me that this has purchase. People live history. They want to understand what's happening to them, and they really it matters to them, like what happened to the world.
And things strike you as relevant in surprising ways.
Yeah.
And would you say that when you watch television, do you like process a historical fiction or docudrama show depicting history differently from how you process just fiction? Like, do you react to something like Chernobyl differently from the way you might react to, like, I don't know, Battlestar Galactica or that may be an extreme example. But
yeah.
Do you feel like you have a different set of critical questions when you see something that's depicting history?
That's for sure true. Yeah. I definitely, because you have to, because you're playing, it's a higher stakes game. I think that's how I take it, which is like, so like Battlestar, actually it's a great example because then I feel like it's a useful, like, total polar opposite, because Battlestar is like, the story affects no one. Like, if that makes sense, like, Cylons aren't a real constituency, so as far as I know, so we don't.
That was my feeling.
I don't know. So we and like those planets aren't real places, so they are existing totally in their space. But as soon as it starts moving closer to the things that are documented or things that are discussed or people whose lived realities are in the world, then it's like, well, how does it intersect with those things? I mean, like in the and that was, to go back to Chernobyl for a second again, I think we were talking about this before, but so now Russia is going to create, like, a Russian production company is going to create a Russian history of Chernobyl with I believe Russian actors in Russian.
Yeah.
And it is because the English language one was, like, wildly popular in Russia, and like people didn't know, or they knew but they didn't know the whole story, and they are kind of like, well, fuck this biased version, but they would still rather know than not know, I think. And there's like anecdotally there are these monuments to liquidators throughout the area around Chernobyl, and like people were leaving flowers at them for the first time in years. Like, people had never, like, again, it's
That's
just not knowing what it is or what it means. And now I'm curious about, like, I feel I'm very, like, I don't know anything about these reports that I heard or about the climate in Russia, about an American-British production and what that would mean. But I do think that, like, it having legs really fascinates me. Like, it having legs in Russia just, like, really fascinated me. That like,
is very interesting.
There's an appetite for our history. I think that's like,
well, and it's like a little bit of an echo of what happened in the Soviet period too, where American literature, Western literature, sometimes journalism about the Soviet Union would be circulated, like, you know, underground in manuscript. That's very interesting. Yeah. So I'm really curious about that project you brought up.
I know. I'm desperate to see it. I mean, it will necessarily cost much less money too. So it's curious, like, how they will, because one of the great things about Chernobyl is that you really can't look at a nuclear reactor, like, inside of it, because it's just a reaction that's happening. Like, it's just energy, like, but they find a way to depict to you, like, the gravity of what's happening by, like, those rods are coming up and you're like, each of those rods weighs a ton, like, this can't be good, and like all of the Geiger counters and stuff. It's difficult to ramp up so much suspense for something that is essentially unseeable. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that part of it too. I'm interested in that.
And how different the human dramas are too. That's
Politically,
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, maybe a good place to wrap up, if you're ready, is I believe Albert Einstein quote about nuclear power. He said it's a hell of a way to boil water, because that's all that the reactors ultimately do, is just boil water to turn turbines.
Oh, really?
It's the heat for the radiation boils the water. And I'm curious to know what you think about all kinds of other things, both about television depicting earlier history, you know, Victoria, all these things we haven't mentioned, and also about, maybe, is this pattern going to roll on up into the 90s? You know, like, are we going to have a similar reckoning? Is this now going to be part of how we process history?
Yes.
I think it's heading that way.
I think absolutely, yeah, because I think that something about there's a few different, like, economic reasons why the scripted series is just, like, the hottest thing in the world. Like, it fits on a platform in a nice way. It takes up a nice amount of time. It's monetizable in a way like feature films aren't. I don't really understand, but, like, it's weird. I should understand more, but it's a little confusing why it's easier to watch 8 episodes of something versus, like, a 90-minute movie in a theater. And, like, mainly the difference seems to be it's at home. But anyway, Yes, I would point to true crime as like a big like precursor to this, because I think that like the true crime podcast, true crime miniseries, like things like Mindhunter, but also like The Act, like Making a Murderer, which is like on the docu-series side. And these are interesting too, because like it moves away from history and more towards journalism with something like Making a Murderer, in terms of like the rules that you're supposed to follow. But as a viewer, you have no idea if they followed like what their integrity or their ethics are, or what their process is. Like sometimes they will show you their process, and sometimes they're not showing you their process. And
and this is Making of a Murderer, I thought was very powerful. We don't have to get into it, but it was a very powerful experience. There were brief moments where I noticed some things and I said, wait a second, they're not explaining that. What's that about? And I found out later, like, okay, well, there are other aspects to the story here that they are not emphasizing in Making of a Murderer. You know, regardless of what that means, regardless of what the ramifications are, it was a selective presentation. And I kind of had to grapple for a minute with, like, was I not thinking in the same critical way while watching that show as I would have if it was a dramatization with actors.
Right.
But because it was real footage, because it was real documents, I was not asking the same questions. And so that's a whole other arena that sort of troubles me sometimes, is like, how do people respond? Or, you know, or when it comes to the case against Adnan Syed, like I can extrapolate what I think my best conclusions are, but am I consuming it the way I should as a historian, and the way I would if it was a depiction of Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
what definitely seems true to me is that like these reinterpretations and retellings of things that are true are going to proliferate, partly because they're more interesting to experience than the bald facts of the true thing.
They tap into a different part of your brain.
They tend to tap into the human. It's telling a story. It's storytelling. Like, this is really But I think that it's great that like a lot of this information is available on the internet. Like, you can Google what really happened in Chernobyl. You'll get like pretty good results. Like, it's going to be confusing, but you'll get pretty good results.
Okay.
But like, with some cases that haven't been reported fully, with really recent history, it might be harder to Google these things. It might be harder to find. So that's where it's like, we're really, what it seems to me is we're muddying our own footprints a little bit, especially with some of the like recent history. Like,
right. Well, and this is part of why I thought I have mixed feelings about television, history on television, is that I do also believe that if you have a certain series of events and a series of characters, it can be very hard to process. It can be very complicated. And seeing someone act a scene out on a screen can be extremely helpful. It gives you this touchstone of, oh, you're talking about this person who pushed this button and this button meant this. It gives you a whole kind of avenue of access to then be able to read about it and understand more. And I think that's part of what people then know and feel when they ask, is this accurate? They're saying, I have now been given this set of visuals and sounds that I can now use to then investigate more of what really happened. So that's part of why I'm maybe more positive about it than some other historians are.
I feel positive about it too. I feel, I mean, I'm coming from a different angle, but I definitely feel the concern of confusion, but on the whole, I don't think telling stories out of our history is new. And I think telling inaccurate stories is definitely not new. So I think that it's just our way of evolving, our way of telling our own myth making. Like but we are encouraging each other to fact check, which is interesting. Like I think that's an interesting part of it. No one was watching like Henry V, Shakespeare's Henry V, and going like, well, did that was Falstaff really a guy though?
Well, too bad they didn't have smartphones. But I think this is a really good place to then think about, maybe we'll have more conversations in the future about different kinds of history.
Thanks for having me, Sam, on your cool podcast.
Thank you. This was great. As usual, a very interesting conversation with Sonia. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Hello.
Hi. Yay,
Oh, good.
it's
Okay.
working.
Good. We both seem to be coming through.
Okay.
I just have this energy.
I think that have you heard my line about this? I think the cat-dog dichotomy is false, just like the gender dichotomy. Yeah. There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum. Everyone identifies the way they want to. There's no need to put people in boxes. That's what I think. So. Hey Sam, it's nice to be here in my living room talking about whatever we're talking about.
We are in Sonia's living room.
Yeah, true.
Do you want to go over anything anymore, or do you feel like just want to jump in and see what happens?
I think we should just jump in and see what happens because I feel like we already got to some interesting material, but my water's going to start boiling. So yes. You think for a second.
Okay.
I'm going to work on my tight five. This is my stand-up routine. I feel like while I'm holding a microphone, I should be doing stand-up. So I should think of a joke.
Yeah, no pressure to be funny.
No pressure.
Right?
I have no comedic strengths.
Did that once. She told me that she just signed up with like no plan and just tried it out, and she's got the chutzpah to do that.
She does. Yeah. She's sometimes all chutzpah.